Today we're going to start an in-depth study of Pelagius.
Welcome to Apologetics from the Attic, the show that seeks to teach and defend the Christian faith in a post-Christian culture. And now, broadcasting from an attic in an undisclosed location somewhere outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, here is your host, Dave Lewis.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Apologetics from the Attic. So what we're going to start here is a series on a topic that has come into vogue in the last couple years, and that is the teachings of Pelagius. And there's various routes to get into this in terms of what's going on in the church and the resurgence of Pelagianism coming from many online apologists. And I'm not going to directly engage with anything they're saying. Instead, I want to go to some secondary and then primary source material. And I put a post on Facebook where I said, if you don't know the difference between secondary and primary sources, you shouldn't even be putting up YouTube videos. But what we're going to do first is we're going to look at a secondary source, and I want to recommend this highly to you. Let's take a look at the book cam if you're watching. Well, actually, let me just show it to you on the main cam. It's Alister McGrath, Alister E. McGrath, Christian Theology, An Introduction. This is the 3rd edition, and this is a very good book, and I just lost what I was gonna. I'll find it. So we're going to read about the Pelagian controversy from Dr. McGrath, who, by the way, is he's the principal of Wycliffe Hall, Oxford, and professor of historical theology at Oxford University. So I've noticed that, and there's many who won't be interested in this content simply because it takes too much sustained effort and energy. Because I've noticed online that we focus just on sound bites, quick things. Someone makes an assertion, it sounds good, it feels good. Unfortunately, that's our culture now. Feeling, emotion overrides everything. And we don't sit and do the hard work. So the master's degree that I earned from Trinity School for Ministry is a church history / systematic theology degree. So hopefully I can demonstrate that I learned something. But this was the textbook we used. And in systematic theology, which that was kind of one of the weaknesses, there wasn't an explicit dogmatic theology taught there. But I'm thankful for the systematic theology class. So let's jump right in, because we're going to do reading. And what we're going to do in this episode is we're going to take a look at what Dr. McGrath says about the Pelagian controversy, and then we are going to actually read Pelagius himself, which I think is important to see what Pelagius taught. Because you actually will hear, well, we don't really know what Pelagius taught because we don't really have a lot of his writings. That's not true. And we don't have as many of his writings as we have other church fathers, but we do have access to Pelagius' writings, which we will see. Let's look at the book cam if you're watching, and let's read. The Pelagian controversy. The Pelagian controversy, which erupted in the early 5th century, brought a cluster of questions concerning human nature, sin, and grace into sharp focus. Up to this point, there had been relatively little controversy within the church over human nature. The Pelagian controversy changed that and ensured that the issues associated with human nature were placed firmly on the agenda of the Western Church. Okay, so pause. Remember, this is how historical and dogmatic theology functions in the church, is many issues aren't brought into focus until a controversy is generated by somebody who ends up later being labeled a heretic, brings into the church a challenge to the consensus, or it hasn't even really been thought through. So this has been happening since the beginning of the church, and it continues to even to this day. Okay, we continue. The controversy centered upon two individuals, Augustine of Hippo and Pelagius. Controversy is complex at both the historical and the theological level, and given its impact upon Western Christian theology needs to be discussed at some length. We shall summarize the main points of the controversy under four heads. Point 1, the understanding of the, quote, freedom of the will. Point 2, the understanding of sin. Point 3, the understanding of grace. Point 4, the understanding of the grounds of justification. Okay, so we start the freedom of the will. For Augustine, the total sovereignty of God and genuine human responsibility and freedom must be upheld at one and the same time, if justice is to be done to the riches and complexity of the biblical statements on the matter. To simplify the matter, a denial of either the sovereignty of God or human freedom is to seriously compromise the Christian understanding of the way in which God justifies man. In Augustine's own lifetime, he was obliged to deal with the two heresies which simplified and compromised the gospel in this way. Manichaeism was a form of fatalism, to which Augustine himself was initially attracted, which upheld the total sovereignty of God, but denied human freedom. While Pelagianism upheld the human will while denying the sovereignty of God. Before developing these points, it's necessary to make some observations concerning the term free will. The term free will, translating the Latin term liberum arbitrium, is not biblical, but derives from Stoicism. It was introduced into Western Christianity by the 2nd century theologian Tertullian. We noted earlier Tertullian's gift for coining new theological terms. Augustine retained the term, but attempted to restore a more Pauline meaning to it by emphasizing the limitations placed upon the human free will by sin. Augustine's basic ideas can be summarized as follows. First, natural human freedom is affirmed. We do not do things out of any necessity, but as a matter of freedom. Second, human free will has been weakened and incapacitated, but not eliminated or destroyed through sin. In order for that free will to be restored and healed, it requires the operation of divine grace. Free will really does exist. It is, however, distorted by sin. In order to explain this point, Augustine deploys a significant analogy. Consider a pair of scales with two balance pans. One balance pan represents good and the other evil. If the pans were properly balanced, the arguments in favor of doing good or doing evil could be weighed and a proper conclusion drawn. The parallel with the human free will is obvious. We weigh up the arguments in favor of doing good and evil and act accordingly. But what, asks Augustine, if the balance pans are loaded? What happens if someone puts several heavy weights in the balance pan on the side of evil? The scales will still work, but they are seriously biased toward making an evil decision. Augustine argues that this is exactly what has happened to humanity through sin. The human free will is biased toward evil. It really exists and really can make decisions, just as the loaded scales still work. But instead of giving a balanced judgment, a serious bias exists towards evil. Using this and related analogies, Augustine argues that the human free will really exists in sinners, but that it is compromised by sin. For Pelagius and his followers, such as Julian of Eclanum, however, humanity possessed total freedom of the will and was not totally responsible for its own sins. Was totally responsible for its own sins. Let me read that sentence again, I'm sorry. For Pelagius and his followers, such as Julian of Eclanum, however, humanity possessed total freedom of the will and was totally responsible for its own sins. Human nature was essentially free and well created, and was not compromised or incapacitated by some mysterious weakness. According to Pelagius, any imperfection in man would reflect negatively upon the goodness of God. For God to intervene in any direct way to influence human decisions was equivalent to compromising human integrity. Going back to the analogy of the scales, the Pelagians argued that the human free will was like a pair of balance pans in perfect equilibrium, and not subject to any bias whatsoever. There was no need for divine grace in the sense understood by Augustine, although Pelagius did have a quite distinct concept of grace, as we shall see later. In 413, Pelagius wrote a lengthy letter to Demetrias, who had recently decided to turn her back on wealth in order to become a nun. In this letter, Pelagius spelled out with remorseless logic the consequences of his views on human free will. God has made humanity and knows precisely what it is capable of doing. Hence, all the commands given to us are capable of being obeyed and are meant to be obeyed. It's no excuse to argue that human frailty prevents these commands from being fulfilled. God has made human nature and only demands of it what it can endure. And then here's a quote from Pelagius and from that letter. Instead of regarding God's commands as a privilege, we cry out at God and say, "This is too hard. This is too difficult. We cannot do it. We are only human and hindered by the weakness of the flesh." What blind madness! What blatant presumption! By doing this, we accuse the God of knowledge of a twofold ignorance, ignorance of God's own creation and of God's own commands. It would be as if, forgetting the weakness of humanity, which after all is God's own creation, God has laid upon us commands which we were unable to bear. And at the same time, may God forgive us, we ascribe to the righteous one unrighteousness and cruelty to the Holy One. First, by complaining that God has commanded the impossible. Second, by imagining that some will still be condemned, so that some will be condemned by God for what they could not help, so that the blasphemy of it, God is thought of as seeking our punishment rather than our salvation. Pelagius thus makes the uncompromising assertion that, quote, since perfection is possible for humanity, it is obligatory. The moral rigor of this position and its unrealistic view of human nature saved only to strengthen Augustine's hand as he developed the rival understanding of a tender and kindly God attempting to heal and restore wounded human nature. So there you go. So what I want to do in some of these videos, I know it's going to take a while, and I know that it's going to be you have to sustain yourself and listen, but I know a lot of people like me listen to hour-long podcasts with no problem. So I know this is a very limited audience, but I do want people to take a deeper dive. So what we're going to do next is we are actually going to, let's see if I can pull it up. We're actually going to look at this letter that Dr. McGrath referenced, a letter from Pelagius to Demetrias. And the first two paragraphs here, if you're watching, I have it open on the browser here so you can see it. Close that. All right. All right, so we're going to start at paragraph 2. I'm just going to read it, and then I'll stop and make some comments. But this is worth the time. Maybe I'll make this an hour long. We'll see how far we get an hour. This is a pretty long letter, but these are the words of Pelagius himself. So let's look at what Pelagius himself says, and let's try to make some application. Because what I'm trying to accomplish is, don't just take people's word that they'll tell you what Pelagius actually believed. They'll tell you that we got Pelagius wrong, and Augustine was politically motivated, and all these things people will say. Because their agenda is actually to rehabilitate Pelagianism, because they have an axe to grind against Protestant theology many times. And they don't realize it, many of them, but they are attacking the heart of the gospel, or at the very least, they inconsistently hold to the heart of the gospel, but they are opening it up for degradation, corruption, and eventual destruction, because they're taking away many safeguards. But we'll talk about that as we go. So I'll start quoting Pelagius here. Here's Pelagius, quote, whenever I have to speak on the subject of moral instruction and the conduct of a holy life, it is my practice first to demonstrate the power and quality of human nature and to show what it is capable of achieving, and then go on to encourage the mind of my listener to consider the idea of different kinds of virtues in case it may be of little or no profit to him to be summoned to pursue ends which he has perhaps assumed hitherto to be beyond his reach. For we can never enter upon the path of virtue unless we have hope as our guide and a companion, if every effort expended in seeking something is nullified in effect by despair of ever finding it. Okay, so what Pelagius basically just said there is, the first thing when you're teaching someone about morality and how to become a better person, more moral person, is you have to convince them that they are able to do it, that their human nature is able to do it. And you need to be told, listen, you can do this. Now, we'll see if he mentions, but you need the help of the grace of God, right? Because we would say, yes, you should have some hope that you can change by the grace of God. And this becomes important in Pelagius versus Augustine. So thus far, he hasn't mentioned grace. He just says human nature in and of itself has a power and quality that you can do these things. Let's continue, Pelagius. I also think that on this occasion, when the good in our nature calls for a further exposition commensurate with the greater perfection of life, which has to be inculcated in the listener's mind, I have special grounds for adhering to the same sequence of exhortation as I have followed in my other minor works, in order that the mind may not become more negligent and sluggish in its pursuit of virtue as it comes to believe less in its ability to achieve, supposing itself not to possess something simply because it is unaware that it is present within. So, in other words, what Pelagius is saying there is people just don't realize how much power they have within themselves to do what is right. They're deceived. They just need to believe in themselves and believe in what they are able to do. Does this sound familiar? I mean, a lot of this will start to sound familiar. I hope you start to see that the way he talks sounds a lot like someone like a Joel Osteen, for example. Let's continue. When it is desirable for a man to put a certain capacity to use, it always has to be brought to his attention, and any good of which human nature is capable has to be revealed, since what is shown to be predictable must be put into practice. No, since what is shown to be practicable must be put into practice. Let us then lay this down as a first basis for a holy and spiritual life. The virgin must recognize her own strengths, which she will be able to employ to the full, only when she has learned that she possesses them. The best incentive for the mind consists in teaching it that it is possible to do anything which one really wants to do. Did you hear that? So this is Pelagius. The best incentive for the mind consists in teaching it that it is possible to do anything which one really wants to do. And then he says, in war, for example, the kind of exhortation which is most effective and carries the most authority is the one which reminds the combatant of his own strengths. Okay, so there's the first paragraph we read here from this letter. So what's he saying in this first paragraph? Basically, to sum it up, the person who is seeking on moral instruction in a holy life must be told that they are able to do it. They have the ability. Now, we'll see if Pelagius tells us where this ability comes from and if it's hindered by sin in any way. Let's continue. First, then, you ought to measure the good of human nature by reference to its creator. I mean God, of course. If it is he who, as report goes, has made all the works of, and within the world good, exceedingly good, how much more excellent do you suppose that he has made man himself, on whose account he has clearly made everything else? And before actually making man, he determines to fashion him in his own image and likeness, and shows what kind of creature he intends to make him. Okay, so he's talking about the creation of humanity. So he's saying, okay, let's make this connection between human nature and God declared everything good, exceedingly good in Genesis 1 and 2. Yes, of course he did. So that's correct. And God made the world, and God made man as his crowning jewel. And furthermore, he says that he's fashioning man in his likeness and image. So far, so good, right? So I agree. We agree with Pelagius on this so far, that the goodness of the original creation of humanity is not to be denied. Let's continue. Next, since he made all animals subject to man, and set him as Lord over creatures which have been made more powerful than men, either by their bodily size and greater strength, or by the weapons which they have in their teeth, he makes it abundantly clear how much more gloriously man himself has been fashioned, and wants him to appreciate the dignity of his own nature by marveling that strong animals have been made subject to him. For he did not leave man naked and defenseless, nor did he expose him in his weakness to a variety of dangers, but having made him seem unarmed outwardly, he provided him with a better armament inside, that is, with reason and wisdom, so that by means of his intelligence and mental vigor, in which he surpassed the other animals, man alone was able to recognize the maker of all things and serve God by using those same faculties which enabled him to hold sway over the rest. Moreover, the Lord of justice wished man to be free and act not under compulsion. It was for this reason that he left him free to make his own decisions, Sirach 15:14, and set before him life and death, good and evil, and he shall be given whatever pleases him. Hence we read in the book of Deuteronomy also, I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse, therefore choose life that you may live. Okay, so interesting what Pelagius says here, huh? So he talks about the human beings, and now notice, when he says man, humans, he doesn't, so it seems like he skips, right, from Adam and Eve. Is he talking about Adam and Eve? Well, obviously, at the beginning he's talking about him, but he skips right to Deuteronomy in this passage in Sirach, which talks about making choices, and these revelations were made way past Adam and Eve. But back to this, just to note, he says animals are stronger than us, more fierce than us, more powerful, more dangerous, because they have armament in their teeth and their claws and things like this. But our armament is reason and wisdom, and our intelligence and mental vigor, which makes us different than the animals, which we don't have any problem with. Now, I didn't check my Bible works. I apologize, to see if I have the Apocrypha in this. I think I do. Let's see. I thought I did. I know I have it in here somewhere. Let's see. Do we have a Catholic Bible in here? The Dewey Rames American Edition. I'm sure it's in here. There it is. So let's look this one up. Sirach 15:14. Oh, let me open this up if you're watching. I'll pull Bible Works up on the screen. There it is. Okay, so there's Sirach. So this is an apocryphal book, if you're not aware. This isn't a Roman Catholic Bible. I'm not in a Protestant Bible. Let's read the context here. Well, this is good stuff to read, just, if we're just doing reading. So I'll just, Sirach 15:1. He that feareth God will do good, and he that possesseth justice shall lay hold of her. And she will meet him as an honorable mother, and will receive him as a wife married of a virgin. With the bread of life and understanding she shall feed him, and give him the water of wholesome wisdom to drink. And she shall be made strong in him, and he shall not be moved. And she shall hold him fast, and she shall not be confounded, and she shall exalt him among his neighbors. In the midst of the church he shall open his mouth, and shall fill him with the spirit of wisdom and understanding, and shall clothe him with a robe of glory. She shall heap upon him treasure of joy and gladness, and shall cause him to inherit an everlasting name. But foolish men shall not obtain her, and wise men shall meet her. Foolish men shall not see her, for she is far from pride and deceit. Lying men shall not be mindful of her, but men that speak the truth shall be found with her, and shall advance even till they come into the sight of God. Praise is not seemly in the mouth of a sinner. For wisdom came forth from God, for praise shall be with the wisdom of God, and shall abound in a faithful mouth, and the sovereign Lord will give praise unto it. Say not, it is through God. Say not, it is through God that she is not with me, for do not thou the things that he hateth. Say not, he caused me to err, for he hath no need of wicked men. The Lord hateth all abomination of error, and they that fear him shall not love it. God made man from the beginning, and left him in the hand of his own counsel. He added his commandments and precepts. If thou wilt keep the commandments and perform acceptable fidelity forever, they shall preserve thee. And he goes on and on. Okay, let's read the whole thing. He hath set water and fire before thee. Stretch thy forth thy hand which thou wilt. Before man is life and death, good and evil. That which he shall choose shall be given him. For the wisdom of God is great, and he is strong in power, seeing all men without ceasing. The eyes of the Lord are toward them that fear him, and he knoweth the work of all men. For he hath commanded no man to do wickedly, and has given no man license to sin, for he desireth not a multitude of faithless and unprofitable children. Okay, so that's the first one that Pelagius quotes. We go back to Pelagius here. He's saying, what's he getting out of this verse? Moreover, the Lord of justice wished man to be free to act and not under compulsion. It was for this reason that he left him free to make his own decisions, and set before him life and death, good and evil, and he shall be given whatever pleaseth him. Okay, so that's Sirach that we just read. Hence we read in the book of Deuteronomy also, I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse, therefore choose life that you may live. So according to Pelagius, these two texts teach that man is free to act and is not under compulsion. So, this is very important. What does it mean to be under compulsion? It means that you're not free to do otherwise. There's some force or something that's causing you to, even if you wanted to do something, you are not able to do it, right? And this is saying that we're free to either do good or evil, to pursue life or death. And then, of course, we have Deuteronomy 30. Let me go back to the English Standard here. Deuteronomy, what are we at? 30, verse 19. Take a look at that. You're watching. There it is. It's up. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life that you and your offspring may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying his voice and holding fast to him. For he is your life and length of days, that you may dwell in the land of the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, to Jacob, to give them. So remember, the question in this controversy, the Pelagian Augustine controversy, is when the commandments of God are spoken, what effect does it have on human nature? What is the response of human nature? And then the distinction is made, is there a difference between when the commandment was spoken to Adam and Eve before they fell into sin and afterwards? Because the Pelagian approach is that human beings are in the same state that Adam and Eve were in their ultimate human nature, made in the image of God. Now, Pelagianism will clearly affirm that there's clearly an external difference between human beings post-Garden of Eden versus pre-Garden of Eden, namely that there's now death in the world, and there is sin in the world, and there is Satan, and there is the decay and death and destruction all around us. But the inner sanctum of our human heart is not tainted by sin. And remember, Pelagius's reason for this is because it's a theological one. He thinks that this is an affront to God to say that he would give commands that we're not able to keep. But Augustine comes along and he teaches that the law of God actually is meant to show us that we are sick and unable to keep God's commands, and therefore we need grace. And grace isn't just the good example of God or Christ, which Pelagius seems to teach, but grace is, as a matter of fact, the healing power of God that heals us internally and helps us. And then, of course, Augustine has a very strong view of that the fall of Adam and Eve did corrupt our natures and make us unable to keep God's commands. So let's continue with Pelagius. Let's let Pelagius speak for himself here. That is why we must now take precautions to prevent you from being embarrassed by something in which the ignorant majority is at fault for lack of proper consideration, and so from supposing with them that man has not been created truly good, simply because he is able to do evil, and is not obliged by the overpowering inclination of his own nature to do good, on compulsion, and without any possibility of variation. Okay, so let's try to break that down. So what he's saying is, and he's saying that many people take this position, the ignorant majority believes this, is that man has not been created truly good. And what's the evidence that man is not created truly good? Because he's able to do evil and not obliged by the overpowering inclination of his own nature to do good on compulsion without any possibility of variation. So I think what he's saying there is there's people who are saying, look, if we were truly created good, we wouldn't even have the ability to do evil. I think that's what he's saying. If we were truly created good, goodness means not having the ability to even do evil. And Augustine is challenging that and saying, no, that's not the proper definition of goodness. The proper definition of goodness is having the ability to do good or do evil. He continues. If you reconsider this matter carefully and force your mind to apply a more acute understanding to it, it will be revealed to you that man's status is better and higher for the very reason for which it is thought to be inferior. It is on this choice between two ways, on this freedom to choose either alternative, that the glory of the rational mind is based. It is in this that the whole honor of our nature consists. It is from this that its dignity is derived, and all good men win others' praise and their own reward. Nor would there be any virtue at all in the good done by a man who perseveres, if he could not at any time cross over the path of evil. So basically what he's saying there is our goodness is established because we have the freedom to choose otherwise. We have the freedom to choose either alternative. That's the whole honor of our nature, is good men win others' praise and their own reward. And then evil earns its own reward of punishment. Okay? So, once again, this is true if we're talking about Adam and Eve. But once again, the crux of the matter here is, what happened to this good human nature post-fall? Was it harmed? Was it sickened? Was it twisted in any way? Was it lost? Or is it intact? Let's continue. Here's Pelagius again. It was because God wished to bestow on the rational creature the gift of doing good of his own free will, and the capacity to exercise free choice by implanting in man the possibility of choosing either alternative, that he made it his peculiar right to be what he wanted to be, so that with his capacity for good and evil, he could do either quite naturally and then bend his will in the other direction too. He could not claim to possess the good of his own volition, unless he were the kind of creature that could also have possessed evil. Our most excellent Creator wished us to be able to do either, but actually to do only one, that is good, which he also commanded, giving us the capacity to do evil, only so that we might do his will by exercising our own. That being so, this very capacity to do evil is also good. Good, I say, because it makes the good part better by making it voluntary and independent, not bound by necessity, but free to decide for itself. We are certainly permitted to choose, oppose, approve, reject, and there is no ground for preferring the rational creature to others except that, while all the others possess only the good derived from their own circumstances and necessity, it alone possesses the good of free will also. So notice for Pelagius, this is the ultimate good here. And a very good thing is the capacity to also do evil equally. And back to what we heard Dr. McGrath say in his book, the balance scales here are perfectly balanced. The balance pan of evil is not weighted in any direction. It is equal. And so for him, the freedom, you have to be able to choose equally good or evil for human beings to be truly rational and created by God in the image of God. So here we go. Now let's see what Pelagius thinks about those who would speak against this. But most of those who, from lack of faith as much as of knowledge, deplore the status of man are, I am ashamed to admit it, criticizing the Lord's work and asserting that man ought to have been so made that he could not do evil at all. And we are then in a position where what is molded says to its molder, "Why have you made me thus?" Interesting. And he quotes Romans 9:20. So that's interesting. So the objection of the potter clay analogy that Paul's working with in Romans, Pelagius is using that to say, if you say that human beings are sinners, or no, that's not even what he's saying. What he's saying here is he's talking about God should have made Adam and Eve. Let's assume he's just talking about Adam and Eve here. God should have made Adam totally unable to do evil. Why did God make Adam and Eve able to do evil or do good? And of course, for Pelagius, it's because human free will is the central aspect of the image of God. To say that, well, we have to be able to do good or evil equally. And he's saying if someone challenges that, they're challenging the Creator. Which, once again, if we're talking about Adam pre-fall, there's really not a lot of argument here. Yes, it is true that God put Adam in a test, that he was capable of either obeying or disobeying, and that did demonstrate his freedom on one level. So far, we don't have a lot to argue with Pelagius about here if he's talking about Adam. Now, the question is he going to take all this and say, have a transition point where he says, well, but then the fall of Adam changed this, and he doesn't end up doing that. Let's continue. What time are we at here? 35 minutes. And these most shameless of men, while hiding the fact that they are managing quite well with what they have been made, would prefer to have been made otherwise, and so those who are unwilling to correct their own way of life appear to want to correct nature itself instead, the good of which has been so universally established in all that is sometimes reveals itself and brings itself into notice even in pagans who do not worship God. For how many of the pagan philosophers have we heard and read and even seen before ourselves to be chaste, tolerant, temperate, generous, abstinent, and kindly, rejecters of this world's honors as well as its delights, lovers of justice no less than knowledge? Whence, I ask you, do these good qualities pleasing to God come to men who are strangers to him? Whence can these good qualities come to them unless it be from the good of nature? And since we see the qualities of which I have spoken contained, either all in one person or severally in several persons, and since the nature of all is one and the same, by their example they show each other that the qualities which are founded either altogether or in all severally in each one are able to exist in all alike. But if even men without God can show what kind of creatures they were made by God, consider what Christians are able to do, whose nature and life have been instructed for the better by Christ, and who are assisted by the aid of divine grace as well. Okay, so here is where I think Pelagius makes the transition from not making a distinction between human nature pre-fall and human nature post-fall. Because here, he uses the example of pagan philosophers and says, look at the pagan philosophers. There's many of them that are chaste, tolerant, temperate, generous, abstinent, and kind. And they reject the honors as well as the delights of the world. And they love justice no less than knowledge. And he says, he's very clear, where do these qualities pleasing to God come from? So they're pleasing God, first of all, which is interesting. Where do these come from? Well, it's from the good of nature. So if Pelagius takes evidence that human nature is created good by the fact that there are people that do good from time to time that are found in all nations and among all men. And then he says, but so if these people without God can do good and show what kind of creatures they were made, consider what Christians are able to do. And notice he talks about that Christ has instructed them for the better and existed. And so here's where Pelagius does talk about grace. They are assisted by the aid of divine grace as well. Interesting. Let's continue. Because remember, the point of this isn't for me to sit here and riff on Pelagius, and let's just read as much of this as we can, because remember, and this is a primary source. Remember, we're reading from Pelagius himself. Secondary source is to read, like Dr. McGrath, he's writing about Pelagius. We're reading Pelagius himself, which I think is important. Come now. Okay, this is Pelagius. Come now, let us approach the secret places of our soul, and let everyone examine himself more attentively. Let us ask what opinion our own personal thoughts have of this matter. Let our conscience itself deliver its judgment of the good of nature. Let us be instructed by the inner teaching of the mind, and let us learn about each of the good qualities of the mind from no other source but the mind itself. So that's an interesting epistemology, source of knowledge there from Pelagius. So how are we going to examine, our opinion on the judgment of the goodness of nature? Well, what he says we need to do is we need to go from no other source but the mind itself. That's very interesting, isn't it? So I am to look inside myself and inside my mind and see what I think about whether I have a good nature or not. Now, I would say that's pretty dangerous because, of course, I think the nature of sin is going to be primarily to convince you that you are a good person and that you have a good nature. But anyway, let's continue. Why is it, I ask you, that we either blush or fear at every sin we commit, displaying our guilt for which we have done at the moment by the blush of our countenance, and another by its pallor, anxiously trying to avoid any witness even of our smallest offenses and suffering pangs of conscience all the while? And why, on the other hand, are we happy, resolute, bold, after every good deed we have done? And if this fact is hidden from sight, desire and wish it to be seen in broad daylight. Why else? So why is it that we feel guilty when we do wrong and feel good when we do right, is what Pelagius is asking. Well, here's his answer. Why else, unless it is because nature itself is its own witness and discloses its own good by the very fact of its disapproval of evil, and by putting its trust only in a good deed, shows what alone benefits it. Hence it comes about that frequently, though a murderer's identity remains concealed, torments of conscience make furious attacks on the author of the crime, and the secret punishment of the mind takes vengeance on the guilty man in hiding. Nor is there any room for escape from punishment after the crime has been committed, since guilt is itself the penalty. That is why the innocent man, contrariwise, enjoys the peace of mind that comes from a good conscience, even while undergoing torture, and though he fears punishment, still glories in his innocence. Okay, so the fact that we feel good or feel bad, and the fact that we have this deep conviction of sin when we do wrong, and he uses the example of a murderer, that is showing the inherent goodness of human beings. It's interesting. Let's continue. There is, I maintain, a sort of natural sanctity in our minds, which, presiding, as it were, in the mind citadel, administers judgment equally on the evil and the good, and, just as it favors honorable and upright actions, so too condemns wrong deeds, and on the evidence of conscience distinguishes the one side from the other by a kind of inner law. Nor, in fine, does it seek to deceive by any display of cleverness or of any counterfeit brilliance in argument, but either denounces or defends us by the thoughts themselves, surely the most reliable and incorruptible of witnesses. This is the law which the apostle recalls when he writes to the Romans, testifying that it is implanted in all men and written as it were on the tablets of the hearts. For when Gentiles who have not the law do by nature what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that what the law requires is written in their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse, or perhaps excuse them. It is this law that all have used, whom Scripture records as having lived in sanctity and having pleased God between the time of Adam and that of Moses. Some of these must set before you as examples, so that you may not find it difficult to understand how great is the good of nature, when once you have satisfied yourself that it has been replaced, that it has replaced the law in the task of teaching righteousness. Okay, so here's where we get into Pelagius's biblical theology. So first he quotes Romans 2:15 and 16, where Paul is in the midst of an argument about how the law of God, even though the pagans do not have the law as the Jews did, namely the written commandments, they still show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts. And this is where Paul talks about the conscience. So now what Pelagius is going to do is he's going to say, okay, this demonstrates that all human beings have the law written on their heart, and in this law, and now he's going to go over biblical characters that please God between the time of Adam and Moses. And why must they be set before us as, examples, right? They must be set before us as examples. Why? So that you may not find it difficult to understand how great is the good of nature, when once you have satisfied yourself that it has replaced the law in the task of teaching righteousness. Okay. So he's going to now walk through biblical characters and show how they teach that nature is good. Human nature is good and not impacted by sin, apparently. So he starts with Abel. So this is interesting. So here's Pelagius's biblical theology. What we can gather from this letter is, so we have Abel, right? Cain and Abel right after the fall of Adam and Eve. So let's see what Pelagius says. This is going to be important. Okay, so we got about 16 minutes. I don't want to go longer than an hour on this. Abel was the first to follow this mistress, and so served the Lord, that when he offered him a victim, his sacrifice was so gratefully received by God that it aroused the jealousy of his brother. And the Lord himself, recalling this righteous man in the gospel, briefly set forth the grounds of his perfection. So this is interesting. Let's look at this. Pelagius then quotes Matthew 23:35 to say that Jesus is teaching. Hold on, let's go there. Matthew 23:35. Okay. So this is where Jesus is rebuking the Pharisees, and he says, "Therefore I send you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of you will kill and crucify, some you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of innocent Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar." Okay, so according to Pelagius, I guess he's calling Abel innocent Abel, right? Let's see what the Greek word is there. The blood of Abel, the right or just. Okay, the dikaios. The blood of the righteous, the just. Okay. Okay, so let's go back to Pelagius. So what was he saying about that again? He says, the Lord himself, for calling this righteous man the gospel, briefly set forth the grounds of his perfection. Okay. And yeah, the term innocent, I mean, the ESV handles it with the word innocent, but every other translation, New American Standard, NET, NIV, KJV, uses the term righteous Abel. So that's interesting. Okay, so here's Pelagius again. For every form of virtue is contained under the name of righteousness. As we read that the blessed Enoch so pleased God that he snatched him away from the midst of mortals and translated him from his earthly habitation after reaching perfection in this world. Okay, so Abel and now Enoch. And notice what he says. Abel reached perfection in this world, and that's why God took him. And Abel is perfect. So he is taking, look at these, in other words, these are people who kept God's law perfectly. That's what I'm getting out of this. Now he goes to the next person. Noah. Right? Oh, sorry. Oh, wait, how does it do that? That's interesting. Sometimes I'm able to manipulate this directly, so just interesting. All right, I'm sorry. Where were we? We were about to talk about, there it is. So he talked about Abel, and he talked about Enoch. Now, next, he's going to talk about Noah. Noah is said to have been a righteous man, blameless in his generation, Genesis 6:9. And his holiness is all the more to be admired, in that he alone was found to be righteous when literally the whole world was declining in righteousness, nor did he seek a model of holiness from another, but supplied it himself. And for that reason, when the destruction of the whole world was imminent, he alone of all men was to be found worthy to hear the words, "Go into the ark, you and your household, for I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation." Okay, whoa. Let's look at these texts for a moment. Oops. 5 works. All right. So first, well, let's look at that Genesis one first. Genesis 7:1. So he says, the Lord said to Noah, "Go into the ark, you and your household, for I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation." So according to Pelagius, what this verse means is that Noah, by his obedience, earned the right to enter the ark. Now, I got a couple of things to say about this. So let's go back first. Let's go back to Genesis 6:9. I find it interesting. And this is interesting. Now, so Genesis 6:9, Pelagius said, let's go back to Pelagius. He said, sorry, this thing has to be open. And see if I do it that way, it messes it up. I'm sorry. This is just inside baseball. Okay. He says of Genesis 6:9, Noah was said to have been a righteous man, blameless in his generation, right? So we're talking about Noah. talking about Noah, and he's using him as an example of this, of the goodness of human nature, right? Now, if you look at the text, though, you have Genesis 6:9, but then look at the context. Genesis 6:8. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And let's make sure, we've got to study the biblical text properly. So the Septuagint handled that what? See it? You can see the cursor. You can't see the parsing, but Karin, grace. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And then you see that's the Hebrew term for grace right there. Okay. So there it is. So notice Pelagius doesn't mention. So this is what Augustine will come along and say, well, wait a minute. Doesn't it say that grace preceded the next verse, which is what? These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. But remember, Genesis 6, 1, when man began to multiply in the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, and the sons of God saw the daughters of man were attractive, and they took their wives that they choose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide with man forever, for he is flesh. His days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth. We won't get into that. Okay, look at Genesis 6:5. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. But according to Pelagius, I suppose, Noah, by his own free will and his own inner goodness that he brought forth from the womb, he was able to make himself righteous, or this righteousness that Noah had was not because of a work of God's grace. Now, let me just say this about Noah. To understand Noah properly, I think you have to see it in two ways. The first way is that Noah, as a man created by God, and his own personal relationship and standing before God, which is based on grace, I believe, because it says Noah found grace. Then, of course, the biblical passage, which I don't think Pelagius deals with, I know he doesn't, I don't remember him dealing with it in the letter, is that Noah, even though he obeys God, builds the ark, he then plants a vineyard and gets dead drunk, thus demonstrating that he is not the promised seed of the woman, which you may have thought he was. If you're reading from the beginning of the Bible, maybe this is the seed that will crush the head of the serpent. I mean, the entire earth is the human race is being destroyed, and maybe this is the new Adam, the seed that will conquer, and it ends up not being true. But I also think, to Noah as a man, his personal relationship with God by grace, through faith, but we also have to see Noah as a type of Christ. So there is a sense in which, how do we understand Genesis 7:1? Because it does say, I mean, Pelagius, how are you going to counter what Pelagius says that teaches? Let's go back to Pelagius. What Pelagius says that teaches, right, is he says, for that reason, this is interesting. Let's go back to Pelagius' words about Noah. Noah was said to have been a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Now, notice he doesn't say he found favor, 6:8. And it says that before that description. And his holiness and is all the more to be admired, in that he alone was found to be righteous, when literally the whole world was declining from righteousness. Nor did he seek a model of holiness from another, but supplied it himself. So a lot of assumptions being made there by Pelagius that Noah, by himself, didn't even seek a model of holiness for another, but by himself, because there was no other righteous people on the planet at the time. He is to be admired. And because he was found to be righteous by his own choice. No sense of grace, okay? And for that reason, when the destruction of the whole world was imminent, he alone of all men was found worthy. So he's worthy to hear the words, go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. Now, there's a sense in which, if Noah is a type of the Lord Jesus Christ, yes, because of his obedience, He rescues him and his family from the wrath of God because he is worthy, because he obeyed God. That is exactly what Jesus Christ has done for us, is he is the obedient one. Now, if Pelagius is saying we have to be like Noah to be saved, to ultimate salvation is based on our works, then, okay, well, then I guess that is what we're supposed to do. I think that's what Pelagius is teaching as we continue on this letter. All right, so I have 5 more minutes. So we'll try to get one more paragraph done here, and then we'll conclude. I hope this is helping some of you. Let me grab a sip of coffee here real quick. Hope this is helping some of you. I know this is a deeper study. This video isn't going to win me views and likes and clicks and all this stuff, but I hope if it at least helps one person just to say, okay, let me calm down and get past the hype and emotionalism and actually just study what Pelagius himself actually said, then I've accomplished my goal. Whether I persuade you or not what you believe about this, at least teaching you that there are primary sources out there that you can take the time to read and study. Okay, so let's just try to do one more paragraph of Pelagius here. So remember, what's he doing? He's walking through these biblical passages, or these biblical characters, to make the point that human nature is good. And he hasn't said it explicitly, but human nature is good in the sense of it is able to do right and wrong, and we have all these biblical examples of men who did the right thing and therefore earned God's favor. Interesting. Before God, moreover, that man is esteemed righteous who is both holy in body and heart. Melchizedek is said to have been a priest of God, Genesis 14:18. And his merit can be easily understood from this fact that he signified in advance the Lord's sacrament, which was to come later, and expressed the mystery of the body and blood by the sacrifice of bread and wine, and by the manner of the sacrifice of his prefigured the priesthood of Christ, to whom it is said by the Father, thou art a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek, Hebrews 5:6 and Psalm 110:4. And because he blesses Abraham, the first of the father of the nations, by his faith, he highlights most distinctly the example of him who by his faith has bestowed a blessing on both Jews and Gentiles. Okay, so, well, see, we would not disagree with Pelagius on this. We believe Melchizedek is Christ, and that Christ is the meritorious one, because he says his merit can easily be understood that he signified the Lord's sacrament. Well, we believe he is Jesus. Melchizedek is Jesus, a pre-incarnate Christ. Also, because he blesses Abraham, the first of the father of the nations, by his faith, he highlights most distinctly the example of him who by his faith has bestowed a blessing both on Jews and Gentiles. So he kind of skips, he gives Abraham a passing glance, Pelagius does. I wonder if Abraham doesn't really demonstrate a consistent life of obedience to God. He really doesn't. He's a sinner who has faith, and yes, he does obey God. Once again, Abraham is a type of Christ, as well as, you got to make that distinction with all these men. Now, Melchizedek obviously is different because that's a mysterious appearance of Christ. Now, he keeps going, though, and now he talks about Lot. Lot, too, following the holy Noah in virtue, did not forsake righteousness, though living among examples of so many sinners, but as the example of the whole world could not overcome the latter, so he too maintained his holiness against the vices of the multitude, when all the region in which he lived was sinning, and he, and as the blessed Peter says, was righteous in his seeing and hearing, 2 Peter 2:8, and, said as he was among the most evil men, shunned their evil deeds, both with his eyes and with his ears, and for that reason was snatched away from the fire, as Noah had been snatched away from the flood. Now, that's interesting. So Lot is an example of a man who is not sinning at all, which I understand the New Testament looks at Lot as an example for us. But if you read the biblical narrative, it's interesting that Lot himself hesitates to leave Sodom and has to be actually dragged out by the angels. And what about Abraham's intercession for Lot? Did that have anything to do with him being snatched away from the fire? As he says, as Noah was snatched away from the flood. And then in the next paragraph, he talks about Abraham. So we'll continue I mean, if you look at my YouTube channel, I have all kinds of series that I've started and haven't finished. The story of my life. But there you go. There's Pelagius himself, and that's just what I wanted to do. Just look at Pelagius, it'll give you a taste of it, because I know many of us in this generation and younger may listen to a podcast of somebody read some of this stuff before they'd even think to read it themselves. And if I've accomplished that, then I've done my job. So thank you again for joining me for another edition of Apologetics from the Attic. Hope this is helpful for you. I'm going to continue. I know I'm inconsistent. Some of you who follow my channel, to release things. I want to release one thing a week. It's tough to do. This stuff takes some preparation on my part, and I just have a lot going on in my life, and this isn't I'm not trying to monetize this or do it for a living. It's a hobby of mine. But just please pray for me. Trying to keep going through the book of Romans verse by verse, go through the Gospel of Mark, and then just address current events and things like this. So please like, subscribe, share. There's also audio version of this. If you found me on YouTube, or if you found me on the audio version, there's a YouTube channel, Apologetics from the Attic, and then the website's on there. So thanks for joining me, and God bless.